Welcome back to Man vs. Meeple, the show where we talk about all things board game related. Today we're bringing you a review of one of David's most anticipated games of 2017. We're talking about Dice Forge from acclaimed designer of Seasons, one of your favorite games of all time. We're talking about Regis Bonace.
Yeah, I was looking forward to this because it's from the guy who did Seasons, and because it has that same sort of look and feel for sure. Mm-hmm. He must like art to go along with his games in that similar fashion, because this has that similar vibe. It's not in the Seasons universe. Very different game for sure. We've had a chance to play it, so yeah, we want to bring this review to you. Pretty early review.
So this is a 2 to 4 player game, plays ages 10 and up, and it plays very quickly in about 30 minutes to an hour.
It felt pretty fast. It's a really quick moving game.
It plays very differently between 2 to 4 players, but we'll talk about the aspects and the components and the gameplay, and then we'll get into the review at the very end. So each player is going to start with a player board in front of them. This player board will house 4 different tracks on them. You have the gold track, which is one of the resources. You have sun shards, moon shards, and then the victory points at the bottom of the track. And you'll be moving these resources up and down as you collect them through the course of the game. You have a game board, and around the game board you have cards. The number of cards is determined by the number of players. These locations allow you to come to these particular spots and spend your resources in order to acquire these cards. The cards in the game give you either instant one-time effects and are turned over. Some of them give you activated powers that can be activated on the next time around, and some of them have timed events that only come into effect when certain conditions are met within the game.
Right, some are just victory points too, right?
Yeah, some are just straight-up victory points. In the center of this game board, you have your pawns, which will go out to these locations. You can occupy locations and they get returned to that spot. And then you have a round track around the edge here. And it's either 9 or 10 rounds, depending upon the number of players that you're playing with. You also have a market board, and on this market board you have 2 locations. You have the temple at the top, which have denominations of currency that you have to use to buy new die faces, and then you have a section at the bottom that are tied in very specifically to the cards that you acquire.
Right, some of those won't even come into play depending on what cards you choose here.
Yeah.
Like Jeremy said earlier, it scales for the number of players, and what he meant by that is each stack. There's always going to be 15 cards around the table here,
right.
And there are alternative cards, so some of those are tied to the die faces at the bottom of the market board.
And then each player is going to start with 2 die, and it's really hard to tell on this camera, but one of the dies is a little bit darker than the other, and that's because they start with a different die faces on them. They're typically going to start with a large amount of gold ones, and then some of them will start with a single moon shard and then victory points, and the other one will start with all gold but a single sun shard. And you'll be acquiring new die faces and putting them onto your die. So let's talk about the turn structure itself. This is very unique. Each player will start with a very specific amount of gold at the start, depending upon what player order they are. And then starting with the first player, who will remain this first player for the remainder of the game, that player, along with every other player at the game, is going to pick up their dice and they're going to roll them. And this is called a divine blessing.
Yeah, this is the divine blessing. Once everyone rolls their dice, everyone collects the resources on their player boards from the dice that they just rolled.
Yep.
Then the active player only will then take their actions.
Yeah, well, they first get to do the active bonus if they have an activation bonus.
True.
So some of the cards in the game, once you acquire them, at this portion, which is the second step in the game, they can tap their card and use an activation bonus. These things are such as take one of your die, re-roll it, and then get that resource as well. Or just get a flat-out resource of your choice.
Basically, things that you could use to enhance your turn, because then you're going to carry out the action for your turn. And on the action, you have one of 2 choices. You can either go to the market board,
make an offering to the god.
So you're going to be spending your resources, obviously, to take any number of die faces that you want. The only the rub there is that you can only take 1 die face from each of the different locations.
Right.
And they have to be distinctly different die faces.
Yep.
And add them to your die. Now, of course, you have to spend the resources. When you start the game, you don't have too much going on in the way of resources.
Right.
So some of the juicier faces are a little harder to get, and you have to work up towards those.
Yeah.
The other thing you can do is
You come down to the bottom and make a heroic
feat.
Yeah, when you make a heroic feat, you take your pawn of your color and you decide which one of these markers you wish to go to. When you go to that specific marker, you have to pay either 2, 3, 4, 5, or whatever resource it is, in either moonstones, sunstones, or even a combination of both of them to acquire that particular card. Now, another player can go to that location on their turn, and when they move you back, you get another divine blessing, which means you get to re-roll your dice and get whatever resources that those come up as when you get bumped off. Now, we should note, when you go to the market and you're allowed to buy a die face, you can place them in any one of your dice that you wish.
Right.
There's no restrictions on how you build or how you forge your dice.
Yeah, this is where sort of the strategic aspect of this game comes into play. It's kind of, almost in a deck building sort of way, or any sort of game where you're building your resources or your ability to gather resources. You could load up heavy on one die in one way and load up differently on the other one, or spread it out in between.
And that's definitely one of the neat aspects of the game, because a lot of the die will tie into, or the die faces will tie into what you do with one die, reacting off of the other die, such as multipliers, or even ones that if you roll a blue on this one, it activates something even better on the other die.
There's some very cool die faces and some of the cards that trigger, like Jeremy was saying, based off of certain ways that you might have, certain paths you've gone down to build your die.
So, once the player's turn is over, they'll pass the marker over to the next player. The trick here is, in the unique portion of, is that on their turn, everybody at the table again gets to re-roll their die for a divine blessing and gain those resources. The only difference in a player's turn is they get to go through the activation of their card, they get to go to the market or to the make a heroic feat, and then they get to possibly, which we forgot to mention, at the end of your turn, you're allowed to take an additional action. That's either going to the market again or going back to the board and doing an action, but you have to pay 2 sunstones. And there's some really good iconography on it to remind you of all these different things that you can do on your turn.
Yeah, the game moves along very, very quickly, and I think the idea behind the rolling the dice there is keep players engaged. At first, it does feel a little strange
that you're rolling dice on every player's turn.
You're rolling your dice constantly, but once you sort of embrace that as I'm just continually collecting resources, it's kind of nice to know that when Jeremy's going, I'm gathering resources quite a bit until it's my turn. Then I'm actually able to do a little bit more on my turn. So it's not all just hinging on one roll of the dice where I didn't get anything, I really can't do anything, your turn.
Yeah. It's a beautiful game.
Amazing.
I love the aspect of forging dice. The insert in here is amazing. Like, it stores everything perfectly. I have some pictures up that you guys can take a look at as well. The gameplay is simple, too. The problem with Seasons, really the only problem, I love Seasons for all the deeper mechanics and how all the cards kind of tie into each other, and you can build some really cool, fascinating engines in Seasons.
Yeah, and excellent
The problem with Seasons is it takes 2 hours to play. Even on a 2-player game, it's going to take an hour and a half to play through an entire game.
Yeah, 4-player game of Seasons is really long.
On the flip side, this game seems almost too quick. I mean, you're playing through 9 or 10 rounds. If you're familiar with the game, you can play through it in a half hour.
Yeah, and whether you're familiar or not, it feels like you can't quite get some of the stuff done that you might want to get done. There's some things on the board here that you really have to build towards, and the game, that finish line starts to creep up pretty quickly.
Yeah, and the problem is, too...
Especially in a 2-player game.
Yeah, in Seasons, when you're building all of your cards in front of you, you have clear choices. You're deciding the cards you want to play. In this game, you are truly building an engine with dice, but it's dice. What you roll is what you roll. So if you're taking these incredible die faces, but you're still rolling your native ones on your dice, your engine's not taking place. You're not doing anything. And there's very little dice mitigation in here other than a couple cards that you can collect that will allow you to do like a minor reroll of a particular die. The great saving grace in that is that every turn you're rolling your dice. But again, you're kind of a slave to whatever you roll.
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, I do believe that there's some things you can do, not to mitigate technically, but some things you can do to hopefully increase your chances of better rolls, obviously, when you're adding faces to your die. If you want to go heavy on gold, you can easily spend a fairly small amount of gold midway through the game and have some die that's going to really give you a lot of gold.
Yeah.
One interesting thing about this game, and I would characterize this game, just if we're getting into our review, this to me feels like a great entry-level, and I mean entry-level game for families, younger, more casual players, to get an experience where you're playing a game where you can get your points in a multitude of different ways. There's a lot of different routes you can take in this game for sure to get your points. I think no pun intended, more seasoned gamers will probably feel like they need a little bit more meat on the bone than this game has. But like I said, I think it's a great entry level for people, and kids in particular, to get that experience of where he might be scoring his points one way, I might be scoring my points a totally different way, and they've got some very distinct ways of doing that, especially with some of the components you add.
Yeah. The other portion of it that's a little bit discerning is the fiddliness of it. These components are really, really small. And I would never want to take this to a convention center in fear that these would get lost. When you're forging dice, you're basically taking one piece and you're removing it out, and this thing flies out and putting it in. Now, that's very simple. I mean, they work together like a Lego.
And
they're
cool.
easy to put together, but these things do fly off. You know, and you got to be careful that you don't lose them. So play them at home and not in a convention center.
Right.
Absolutely. I would also say... two more things that concerns for me. One are these cards that are just flat out victory points. I would have rather to have seen cards that allow unique, cool abilities with less large amount of victory points. One of them is worth 26 victory points, which almost everyone gravitates to wanting to get because it's a huge chunk of your points at the end of the game. Now you can mitigate that, of course, with these extra cards in here that can replace some of those cards by giving you more abilities. The other thing I'll say is that this game really shines in a 4-player setting, not so much in a 2-player setting. And the reason for that is one of the better mechanics in the game is blocking these locations. You will see a ton of different cards around here, but each of these cards is tied into one very specific location. So these 2 cards are tied into this location. I could come over here, block this location, and force players, if they want these cards, to push me off.
Right.
In a 2-player game, that's only one other player wanting to go to that spot. They can have all kinds of choices. In a 4-player game, you're blocking a lot of those spots. So you're going to get rerolls more often in a 4-player game.
It changes your strategy, too, because if you're playing in a 4-player game, your initial instinct is to go to the marketplace first. I mean, the game's about building dice, and you don't have really enough of resources to go here anyway. But if you can get to this board early in the game and, like you said, claim that position... Until you do it again, you're going to be in that spot. And say you took, a card that maybe most people at the table are going to want to get. It's a great play to get your guy there. And like Jeremy said, that just doesn't come into play much in the 2-player game.
Even
in
in
fact,
a 3-player game,
one of the 2-player games we played, it never happened.
Yeah.
And the benefit there is being able to take another Divine Blessing. You're able to just get that much more resources.
Yeah, especially if you've been using your time to forge your dice and get better sides. So, my suggestion is if you are heavy experienced gamers, go towards Seasons. That seems to be the game that I would enjoy more. If you have a game that you want to play with your family, younger children. I love the mechanism of the dice forging. I just don't think it's fleshed out enough. I think this is one really strong expansion away from being a really, really good game.
That's what I was just about to say. I think this game has the basis for what could be excellent.
Yeah.
Like, I would love to see what they do with the expansions. For instance, like you said, if some of these cards start to get replaced with some really interesting cards, I think just with the cards alone, you could add some gameplay mechanisms that kind of put a little bit more meat on the bone for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So, guys, this is Dice Forge. Go check it out. If you guys have any questions, please make them in the comments below. Subscribe to us. That helps us out a ton. Join us on Facebook.
Yes,
on
like
Twitter,
us, follow us everywhere you can.
And we will catch you guys next time.
Bye-bye.
Season 1 of Man vs. Meeple is sponsored by our friends at TMG Games. And at Cool Stuff Inc. Cool stuff in stock at coolstuffinc.com.